Let's delve into the Vernacular Press Act of 1878, a significant legislation that challenged this freedom. The Vernacular Press Act was proposed by Lord Lytton, the then Viceroy of India, and unanimously passed by the Viceroy's Council on the 14th of March, 1878. The primary objective? To curtail the freedom of the Indian language press and prevent any criticism directed towards the policies of the British, particularly those viewed as seditious or threatening to British rule. This act stretched its dominion over vernacular newspapers throughout the length and breadth of India, with the South being the only exception. The British colonial administration aimed to establish better control over the vernacular press, punish and discourage what they deemed seditious writing, and prevent newspapers from being used as tools for intimidation and extortion. But what led to the enactment of such a restrictive law? The rapid growth of newspapers in Indian languages posed a significant challenge to colonial authorities. The government's lack of understanding of local languages and their reliance on Indians to interpret the content of vernacular newspapers led to concerns of misinterpretation and potential threats to British rule. Furthermore, the Indian language press was vocal in its criticism of British policies, such as the issue of opium cultivation, which did not sit well with the colonial administration. As a result, the Vernacular Press Act became an instrument of suppression. Newspapers were required to submit proof sheets of their content to the police before publication. The police, not the judiciary, determined what constituted seditious material. Authorities could demand printers and publishers enter into bonds, confiscate material deemed objectionable, and impose fines or seize printing equipment. And if affected by the act, publishers or printers found themselves without legal recourse. The Vernacular Press Act of 1878, an act that was aimed to muzzle the voice of Indian language press, set the stage for a face-off between colonial authorities and the burgeoning vernacular press. What drove the British to enact such a legislation? The reasons are manifold and complex. The rising tide of the Indian language press was one of the key catalysts. The proliferation of newspapers in local languages presented a formidable challenge to the colonial authorities. These newspapers were not just a source of news, but a powerful platform for expressing dissent, critiquing the government, and fostering a sense of national identity among the Indian populace. The British government's lack of understanding of local languages further compounded the issue. The colonial authorities were dependent on Indian intermediaries to interpret the content of these vernacular newspapers. This reliance led to fears of misinformation and manipulation, causing unease among the British ranks. But perhaps the most potent catalyst was the unrelenting criticism of British policies by the Indian language press. Take, for instance, the issue of forced opium cultivation. Many newspapers openly lambasted this policy, highlighting its devastating effects on Indian farmers and the economy at large. Such criticism was seen as a direct challenge to the authority of the British regime and was perceived as a threat to the stability of their rule. The Vernacular Press Act was not just about controlling the press, it was a response to the growing influence and reach of the Indian language press. It was a desperate attempt to suppress dissenting voices and maintain the status quo. But in doing so, the British unwittingly ignited a spark that would only grow brighter and fiercer in the years to come. Thus, the Vernacular Press Act was born out of a colonial desire to control and ultimately silence an increasingly vocal and critical Indian language press. However, far from silencing these voices, the act only served to amplify them, setting the stage for a battle of wills that would reverberate throughout the annals of Indian history. The Vernacular Press Act, with its stringent provisions, was indeed an iron fist in a velvet glove. The Act, in its quest to control the Indian language press, introduced a series of firm measures. One of the first was the requirement for newspapers to submit proof sheets of their content to the police before publication. This essentially meant that every word set to print was under the watchful eye of the colonial authorities. A seemingly harmless requirement, but one that gave the authorities the power to censor any content they deemed inappropriate. The Act also placed the responsibility of determining what constituted seditious material squarely on the shoulders of the police, bypassing the judiciary entirely. This was a significant departure from the norm, where the judiciary would usually play a critical role in such determinations. This provision effectively handed the police a carte blanche to interpret and label content as seditious, leading to potential misuse and abuse of power. Furthermore, the Act gave the authorities unprecedented control over the printers and publishers. They could demand that these entities enter into bonds, essentially agreements promising good behaviour. Failure to adhere to these bonds could result in severe penalties, including fines and confiscation of printing equipment. This provision, coupled with the power to seize materials deemed objectionable, effectively curtailed the freedom of the press and imposed a chilling effect on journalism. But perhaps the most draconian provision of the Act was the denial of legal recourse to those affected. Publishers or printers who fell foul of the Act could not seek redress in courts. They were left to the mercy of the colonial authorities, with no legal avenues to challenge the Act's provisions or penalties. The Act not only stifled the freedom of the press, but also denied legal recourse to those affected, making it a truly draconian legislation. This was the Vernacular Press Act of 1878, a law that sought to silence the burgeoning Indian language press under the guise of maintaining order and stability. The Vernacular Press Act, as expected, had far-reaching repercussions. This legislative steamroller set in motion by the British colonial government in India impacted the freedom of the Indian language press heavily. The Act led to the suppression of the vernacular press. Newspapers in local languages were hit hard as they faced hefty fines, confinement of their editors, and seizure of their printing equipment. The vibrant Indian language news scene was choked and voices of dissent were muffled. The colonial government effectively curtailed the freedom of these newspapers, preventing them from criticising British policies. But the Act did not go unchallenged. It ignited criticism and opposition not just from the press, but also from prominent leaders across Bengal and India. They condemned this Act, seeing it as a stark violation of the freedom of speech and expression. Their voices echoed in the corridors of power, leading to calls for its immediate withdrawal. This opposition was a clear testament to the resilience and unity of the Indian press and leaders against an oppressive regime. Yet, in spite of the Act, the Indian language press managed to continue their critique of government measures. The newspapers, though muzzled, found ways to express their dissent. The tone of their criticism was modified, but they did not back down. They continued to highlight the inadequacies of the British policies, serving as a beacon of hope in an otherwise bleak landscape. This continued critique was a testament to the tenacity of the Indian language press. They refused to be silenced, and their resilience served as a beacon, illuminating the path for future generations of Indian journalists and writers. Despite the oppressive nature of the Act, it was met with fierce resistance and criticism, ultimately leading to its repeal. Before the Vernacular Press Act, there were several events and newspapers that shaped its enactment. Let's delve into these historical pillars of Indian journalism and their influence on the Act's formation. Starting from 1861, Nirdapan, a Bengali drama by Dinabandhu Mitra, portrayed the harsh reality of indigo farmers. The vivid depiction of their suffering was a thorn in the side of the East India Company, leading to the play's ban. This striking piece of literature highlighted the power of vernacular media to expose societal issues, becoming a catalyst for the Vernacular Press Act. In 1870, the Sulabh Samachar was founded by Keshub Chandra Sen. This publication sought to reach literate yet underprivileged audiences, bringing them into the fold of informed citizenry. However, its content aimed at the lower strata of society drew the ire of the colonial authorities, escalating the need for a tighter grip on the vernacular press. The Som Prakash initiated political discussions in 1858, boldly opposing the impending Vernacular Press Act. This fearless stance invited backlash from the government, further intensifying the perceived threat of the vernacular press. The Bengali, founded in 1868, was another vocal critic of the British rule. Despite its financial instability and frequent changes in ownership, it never shied away from expressing views on public issues. This unrelenting spirit further underscored the need for the Vernacular Press Act from the perspective of the British authorities. Lastly, the Amrita Bazar Patrika, which started as a Bengali weekly in 1868, later became bilingual to evade the Vernacular Press Act. Its critical stance towards the British rule put it under immense government pressure, exemplifying the growing influence and resilience of the vernacular press. These events and newspapers played a pivotal role in bringing the Vernacular Press Act to life, their voices echoing in the corridors of power, challenging the British rule. Each publication and event served as a stepping stone towards the Act's enactment, highlighting the profound impact of the vernacular press in shaping the socio-political landscape of India during the colonial era. The Vernacular Press Act of 1878, a piece of legislation that sought to control the Indian language press, was a watershed moment in the history of Indian journalism. This act, proposed by Lord Lytton, was aimed at curbing the growing Indian language press and criticism towards British policies. It led to suppression of press, criticism and opposition from various quarters. Despite its oppressive nature, the Act was eventually repealed in 1880. The Vernacular Press Act serves as a stark reminder of the struggle for freedom of the press in colonial India, a struggle that continues in different forms even today.